Yeah, so thank you for having me. Great university name, by the way, Mihal, Charles University. It must be probably not named after me, but that's a great name. So I was asked to talk to the group here, to the audience, about some methodological issues. I mean, issue per se, like not a problem per se, but as a theme. And yeah, I got to say that I am a kind of a mess in method because I've done a bit of everything. You know, like the jack of all trades and master of none kind of thing. But I'll give you some story later about my own background. We agreed that I will speak mostly on qualitative research, but I also said that okay, I'm one of the my few experiences I had with mixed methods is actually probably more interesting because as you will know later, I was not trained purely qualitative. Actually, I was trained quite in the US, so very naturally quantitative. So you can see already that there was a shift in my view of methodologies. So I'll just say that first of all, I think that in most subjects within the business school and accounting particularly, uh, geographic regions where you are from and where even when you actually conduct the research and you are trained, uh, they are consistent. The similarities and differences are different. So in Europe and Australia, my own observation is that there have been a more dominant qualitative case study, field study, interviews, although this changing now because of the Americanization of journals and they want more like American style research. But historically speaking, and I think still is still true, and it was clearly when John mentioned I was attending CSER. I've been attending for almost 20 years now. It was vastly qualitative, more theoretical studies, field study, interview, and then they would have some quantitative. They remain kind of descriptive and survey level methodology. So that's what I call like qualitative case study. Is like you have sample size that is relatively small. Usually it could be even one case study, one company, but you go more in depth and you go more longitudinal, you go specific, you go more in depth. And I would say in North America, in Asia, from my also own observation, is that it's quite more quantitative. It's different. So at CSER, when I went, we were labeled positivist because we use numbers, right? So whenever you use numbers, okay, you use like large samples. We're talking large sample, it could be hundreds, but it can be also like 20,000 observations. Of course, you use databases, you use proxy, you use statistical tests, regression models. Some of them are simpler than others. I put usual simple here, but those regression models can become very complicated, very sophisticated. And then some market studies, like market oriented, like looking at the value and the stock price reaction on, some information or some other aspects of accounting. And experiments is also quite prominent in North America. So you have also subject that you hire or you ask to participate, and you have um, some scenarios that you ask them to do, answer some questions, etc. It still becomes a quantitative method because you end up having some tables and regressions that give you some results with numbers. So that's a very high level observation that I think depending on where you are and you are trained, and this is obviously not a 100% black or white kind of thing, but there is a trend geographically. And as I mentioned, the blend of quantitative comes to Europe more, and actually the other way around too. Surprisingly, North American researchers have also started adopting because there have been lots of push for that. Of course, it's not at the level that we want to be in terms of balance, but we have seen also that movement. For example, journals like the Accounting Review and even before Contemporary Accounting Research, which I consider the so-called top tier journal in accounting, do have qualitative associate editors. The proportion of it, of course, remains small, but is there. So it has some kind of evolution, but it still remains at that, I think, in these kind of differences. I also want to get to the terminology a little bit later, but there is a classification that yes, it's a bit dated, but I think it was a good exercise to look at some of the studies in social environmental accounting that Elwine compiled, and he kind of put them a little bit simplistically in 4 categories. which I kind of half agree with, and that's why I put that terminology note on the right, and I'll show you. But the top left corner is more like analysis, critical analysis, compilation, literature reviews, or more like sometimes commentary. So basically, there is no like particular data set. You actually look at you use more opinion pieces or viewpoints, which are can be very interesting and useful. And then you have archival, which I think he meant archival, quantitative archival, in terms of having those regressions, those quantitative methods. Cases and qualitative study is the ones I mentioned from the more European side on small sample, deeper longitudinal case study, and then experimental studies. And the point of that paper actually, Elwine, was that there was not enough experimental study in social accounting. So that was kind of illustration. But I also want to give an overview of what I think sometimes is misunderstood or mislabeled, is that first of all, let me just put that all there. So there is the fundamental difference for me in terms of methods is there is difference between empirics and when you don't have data, it's conceptual or even theoretical. Okay, so let's be clear that empirical, it means having some kind of data and observations, right? So when I hear, oh, I'm an empirical, yeah, qualitative researchers are also very much empirical. Like when you have data that is from interview data or field study data or observation, that's empirical as well. So there is a misconception that, oh, I'm an empirical or even archival, and I'll get to that. It's all quantitative regression data. It's not true. Now, the second kind of differentiation is archival versus experimental. It's big difference. Archival, I would call secondary data. So this is from data that you collect from a document or from a database, or you hand collect, and it's there. You don't really talk to anybody, right? You don't need a human being to get that data. So you either hand collect it or you purchase a database if your university can afford it. Versus experimental, which is also quantitative, as I mentioned, but you're going to have ethics approval, and I'll get to that in a minute, that you need to actually ask people for their opinion and for their decision and for whatever you want them to say. And then you have qualitative versus quantitative, which is kind of the topic today. You can have a combination of all. Okay, you could have of almost all. We can have an archival quantitative, which is quite common. Obviously, this is the regression thing I mentioned, but you can also have archival qualitative. You know, like a lot of the researchers in social and environmental accounting field do analyze annual reports qualitatively, do analyze interview or annual reports first. That's considered archival qualitative. Okay, so I go to the CSER conference once in a while or other kind of conference and say, oh, he's archival. Well, most people are archival, right? It's not because you use regressions that you are archival. You can also be archival, analyzing documents from history or books or magazines or reports. And then you can have a quantitative, of course, experimental is quantitative as well. So just that conceptualization of definitions of what it means, I think we have to be careful. I mean, of course, this is just my view, but by definition, if you look at what means all these terms, that's what it does. Okay, in terms of collection, I'll get into more qualitative stuff a little bit later, but what I mean by primary data is this, like you have the survey, you have experimental design, you have to be very careful in designing those. And of course, there's a big question. There was a question at the EAA this year and in many other workshops. What about the human subject ethics approval or protocol? So it varies quite a bit. I'm not going to get into that. It can be subject to questions. But whenever you actually talk to somebody, talk to human beings, you're supposed to get some kind of ethics approval by some kind of committee or process within your university that looked at, okay, you're not going to ask some very strange questions or difficult questions. It's especially true for other fields when you have to deal with vulnerable populations, such as children, disabled, you know what I mean, like people like you, it's more sensitive. Usually in accounting, you don't really have that, although you will, because if you go to the field and you're going to inquire NGO practices in Africa in some sensitive area, then or indigenous population or something like that, it's sensitive. So that's why it's applicable to all, and you have to get those ethics approval whether you do experiment or interviews. So of course, interviews is as I speak, you actually get to the people, you ask the questions, you have different structured, semi-structured, and open interviews as well, meaning that you have prepared questions, and of course semi-structures when you have prepared questions, but hey, based on how the conversation goes, well, you will maybe improvise and come up with new questions and kind of deviate from the protocol you had. And getting informants, as John mentioned, I think when the survey was done with participants, that's the most challenging part. I mean, not everybody is going to be willing and or available to talk to you, especially on some topics that are maybe too sensible or sensitive, right? So that's a challenge for everybody. I think that unfortunately that becomes kind of the so-called strengths or contribution if you get access to these like very unique type of populations or unique type of people or leaders or whoever stakeholders that you want to interview. That's going to be your contribution. So yes, networking and knowing people, yes, like in anything in this world, works and helps. That's an advantage. If you know the CEO of somebody or your family member is, yeah, of course it helps to get informants. And you can argue that it's not fair, but hey, that's that's how the world works, unfortunately. Or you just have to maybe get with co-authors who do have access to those, or co-authors who have access to those may invite you to contribute on something else. But this is something we can talk about. There is no magic formula to get informants except making the right efforts the right way. And I can give you a few tips if we get to the discussion later. So an experiment is kind of similar to get participants. It's slightly easier, I would say, because you always can find incentive. So you can sometimes use students, although using students as participants is trickier to publish. But you can, I use students, and I can tell you that you give them some extra credit mark, or you actually pay them, or you just have a gift certificate or something, or you actually can get to a database. There are many out there that participants are getting systematically paid for their time, and you can get a certain type of a participant. So in some ways, I think it's a little bit easier per se to get participants for experiment than it is for interviews. So once you have the data, and because this is kind of the trick, right, between quantitative and qualitative, I had some slides of quantitative, but I think Jordi will speak to that. The most difficult part is actually collecting the data, getting the data, whether it's quantitative, you hand collect them, or you go to some databases or whatever, or as I mentioned, you get them from primary data such as interview and experiment. Well, what do? You have all this data. Well, it depends on the question you are trying to answer, right? And generally, hopefully you already have that question before, but that question can dynamically change over time, right? I mean, it's one thing I say about publication process is don't let your question get on the way, like let the data speak to you as well, right? So what to do with it, and I had a series of a couple of slides of different analysis for quantitative, but I will leave that to Jordi to explain, and I can also get back to that. But in terms of qualitative, once you have the data and the question, as I say, can slightly change. First of all, we have to understand that qualitative method, I'm speaking for somebody who was not fully trained, but it's by experience and from what I got from our co-authors. In fact, I think I borrowed those slides from somebody, I don't know, I can't remember who, it might have been Brenton or Jeff at that time. I thought I was like, I got permission. Okay, so qualitative method, it is not about generalization. The biggest critique of qualitative is, oh, but you cannot generalize, it's only one case, right? Well, that's not the purpose, okay? It's to particularize it, and it's not the purpose, right? The purpose, the focus is explaining in depth, understanding in depth, as opposed to prediction or make up some kind of inferences or some kind of prediction like you do for a quantitative hypothesis, okay? And that the last one is a bit tricky because we are taught in the PhD program you have to deductive, right? You go by a big theory and then you go empirical. Well, probably the only time that you could do that is during a PhD. Most of the time you are doing inductive research, right? You are driving your research. Your story is told by your data. Okay, the data is there, and the direction and the story may change. And so the induction is usually what focus, especially in qualitative methods, because you have so many different data sources, not in terms of the type, because you'll get usually interviews or field study, but you're gonna get so many different answers that, wow, you have to really look at the data carefully. And speaking of looking at the data carefully is, yeah, again, the method is the social world, the way you view the world. It can help you see that world, interpret it, understand it, and experience it, right? So this is not something a database can help you do. A database is going to give you some results by measuring some proxy and variables. Again, I'm deviating because Jordan is going to talk about that, I'm sure, but it is not the same purpose at all. The data itself looks very different, and the purpose is also very different. Okay, the goal is not the same. And the questions that you are asking for research questions in qualitative study are very different also from hypothesis or even research questions for quantitative. It is not about, is there an association between that, or is a correlation, or is this impact something? It's usually a how and a why questions. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that as well. So the how and why are obviously broader, but that's exactly the purpose of qualitative research, right? You broaden the field to really study a phenomenon from various angles within that case, within that context, okay, from different stakeholders. Because the ideal interviewee set, in my view, some people may not agree, is not to interview like 85 accountants who do the same job, right? You want to have I hope the question is going to allow to bring the voices of others who are around that question. It provides insights into the framing of practice in context. Again, it is not about making some very detailed analysis, and nothing wrong with that, of correlating some variables and measuring the impact and looking at the direction of the, no, it is really insightful, really how it's framed. And also it does give you a sense of kind of closeness to practitioners more, in my view. I mean, when you speak to somebody, obviously you speak to some accountants or professionals or others, I think it looks more real than looking at numbers and databases and looking at all these proxies, right? I mean, let's be honest, like human beings speaking to human beings, okay, it looks more real in my view. So the practitioner, especially, we have this big issue of bridging the gap between practice and research. Well, that qualitative research, in my view, can help doing that, because you get not everything that you see, not everything that you discuss in the interview is published, right? So then you also get some insights outside the paper, and that gives you some background knowledge and some understanding of what. So this is very good for researchers who, for reason others, have never really worked in an organization or worked very little, and then interviewing can give you lots of insights as well, right? So there are different three types of qualitative data. As I mentioned, interviews, usually I would say quite common in terms of, again, as long as you get people to talk to you, but you get people's experiences, perceptions, opinions, feelings, and knowledge. And of course, knowing that they'll be transcribed, knowing that they're recorded, you might have this slight bias towards being shy and not telling you everything. But from my I would say relatively limited experience, people tend to kind of talk a lot. Sometimes you kind of have to stop them and say, "Hey, let's make contract," because they just leash out sometimes. You know, it depends on the question, but yeah, I don't think you should worry about people being shy, because when they accept to interview, they talk, right? And the quotations is, of course, your data itself, and of course you have to add context, and interpretation is key. Then you have a little bit more maybe difficult, but yeah, it's still doing a lot, especially doing for somebody's PhD, is observation. So you go and in the form of, you go out there, you know that you're the observer, you go in the boardroom, you go in organizations for amount of time, like weeks and months, and you observe everything that's happening around you, like activities, behavior, even nonverbal cues, conversations. You obviously have to have all these agreements set up with the organizations that you're allowed to do that, and you take lots of notes. I'm not sure you're not organization let you record and videotape. That's not, I think, very common, and you shouldn't do that. But you have ways to do that, and Of course, the strongest observation is when you actually, it's not even observation anymore, it's ethnographical study when you actually part of an organization. And that's really only possible if you do have the time, because that one requires you month on site to work with them like you were hired by them as an employee. And that requires a whole level of agreements and protocols. But it's quite happens for, again, somebody's PhD. I've known some students who have done ethnographical studies for the PhDs, and you can imagine the richness of the data that you can get. There's too much. So sometimes you have to have very focused questions to tease out what you need, but that's another way. And then, as I mentioned, archival, it's qualitative, so documents, all kinds of documents. It can be letters, it can be minutes, it can be, of course, annual report, sustainability report, of course, press releases, anything that you can find that you don't need to really talk to anybody. Okay, you may need to have access to it through somebody, an authorization, but you don't have to really get the data from a human being, and you get it from the document. The advantage of that is that, okay, it's there and there's nothing you can do. The slightly higher risk for interviews is you may have missed something. You didn't get the answer. You know, like it's kind of not random, but you don't know what to expect. Experiment, obviously, the design is important, but you don't know what to expect. But archive is there to stay, and then you can go back to it anytime and analyze it. So in terms of analysis, you have, you know, maybe technical terms here, but yeah, there are now tools and software that do a lot of things for you. I still believe in manual analysis is also still very, probably the best, because you're the one who are looking at the data yourself, coding, pattern modeling. So you have to kind of classify and sort out the data in a way that is understandable for you, and build some patterns or find some patterns. And then, of course, you have the way you present it, the display. Okay, so matrices help, figures help. Of course, you have to merge a lot of themes. So that's when the fun begins. Like, some people just love doing that. Like that's their like career, like analyzing qualitative data. And I understand that it's a lot of fun. I didn't do that. I did some of that, but not a lot. And when I did it, it was quite fun. So, and then there is kind of interpretation and now reporting on this data about providing the context. What does it mean? And of course, you have to bring the theoretical lens. With the researchers, you have to make sense of that data through some theoretical framework or some analytical tool, right? So this, I told you, this is from some of my the few papers I did on qualitative research. I think the first one was on the AICPA leaders. So the questions can be a bit long, and I admit that those were a bit long. So for example, the how question, there's a lot of how and a couple why. How is the institutional complexity of the accounting field characterized by the coexistence of at least two logics reflecting in AICPA, which is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, like the professional bodies, the leaders of AICPA's discourse to members and outsiders of the Institute before, during, and after the Enron crisis. So a broad question that we had to go for interview transcript. Now, interesting, that one, I'll put a side story, since, you know, I think I can share stories here, that when we submitted this paper, and I came into the journal, it was an AOS submission, and we actually got a tough revisor to submit. And one of the comments, which actually had huge implications, was that, oh, the interview transcript that you use to analyze your data may not be either complete or accurate. It was an official transcript, but they still didn't kind of believe it. And they asked us to go, can you go interview these people again, or like now? And some of these people are like 90 years old, or they may even be dead. And so there was no way that we could do that. And we asked the editor at the time, one of the handling editor, we asked, is it a kind of a break or pass kind of deal? Because there's nothing we can do. It's not something we can do. And she said, yes, you have to do it. We had to pull out the paper. In the end, we eventually published in Critical Perspective Accounting, which is also, we're very happy about that. But that's to tell you also the trick of, you get this qualitative archival data, but then some reviewers will want you to get the real thing because they don't believe it. Or, yeah, to be fair, it's not today's script, but the point of the paper was to analyze what was said before, like then. So I didn't really understand that comment, and I certainly understand the fact that understanding that these speeches are from the 1970s and 80s, some of them, that these people, to find them, good luck, and do, and honestly, there's very likely that they won't be able to do interview because they may not be around anymore, right? Anyway, that's the story that I always say. The other one was another study that I've done with my former PhD student, Hemi, in Korea, to look at CSR professionals. So how do aspiring professionals specialize in CSR in South Korea? So that's, you can see that's very context specific, interpret and make sense of their field and of themselves as professionals. So it was interesting because you can see some professionals who you know, all kinds of answers were there. And then, of course, going back to the analysis tool and coding, we had to find a framework to kind of classify, okay, this is a group of professionals who think a certain way. Some of them were saying they're the saviors of the world and they are like, you know, very called upon to do, and some of them were like very shy, and it was a very contrasting kind of thing. I'm not gonna tell you the whole story, but this is the question we ask. And then the second question was why and how those professionals argued that they surpassed competing group. As I mentioned, like some of them, they felt very superior, like they were like, we are the best, right, kind of thing. So that's, and then we ask why, right? So that's a research question that can only be answered, obviously, with qualitative research. And then this is another one on social entrepreneurship, social venture, is how the social performance like data reference points are formed during the early stage of a social venture, and how those reference points are interpreted and acted by different actors of the organizations below the board level, right? So again, you can see that very interesting questions, I think, and you probably have many of you here a lot. Again, using qualitative methods is probably the best way to go. I will just finish with two experiences I had mixing the method. Nice. Mixing the quant and qual. It have happy ending because they both ended up published, but it's probably the only two I have. This one, so the trick is that yeah, it started was a quantitative paper. It was Michel Rodrigues, one of Michel Rodrigues' PhD paper that, you know, we started with a quantitative database of environmental governance data, committee membership, all of the like 1-0 and all the performance data and all that stuff, right? And then we found some intriguing results that led us, we wanted to know more. And so we wanted to interview some board members who work or did not work in the environment to get their view. So we actually put in the, I think in the introduction, we explicitly wrote in the paper, we adopt a multi-method research strategy. Is more like double method, but the multi-method research strategy consisting of archival data and conducting interview. Archival means, we should have specified, quantitative data. And at the end, the details of our quantitative archival data approach follow, whereas so we separated the analysis, okay, which can be discussed, like whether it's the right way to do, but for our case, it was more, and you will see qualitative was more a complement to the quantitative. It was not a central piece. So the first review comments was about the number of interviews. We had 5. I think we actually have 7, but maybe we did 2 more at the end. But they were concerned about the number of interviews because when you are qualitative researchers, 5 or 7 interviews is not a lot. If your piece is only qualitative, I don't know the magic number, but 7 is clearly not enough. You maybe 20, 30, 40. Some study have 80 interviews. Maybe that's a bit overboard. And so that was kind of the asset. So our answer to the review comments, I'm sharing this. Please don't like copy paste all those things or take photo, but just sharing that. Yes, we kind of emphasize that the limited number of interviews, it was about reflecting the nature of the analysis, which was complementary rather than central. And we didn't make that clear. It could be like, oh, they're doing like equal weight on quant and qualitative method. And what is this? We have this huge like analysis of quant and they have like 5 interviews. And we say, no, this is really to complement the view and to try to explain, but it was not a central piece. And that probably the other reviewer, same thing. It was they're obsessed with the number of interviews. And maybe those were quantitative reviewers who thought 5 is not enough. I don't know exactly who the reviewers, obviously we don't know. But again, we have to explain that we did not intend to claim that these 5 interviews validate our, it was not. It was really to provide some more insights on them, but it was not to validate and say, yeah, this is right. In fact, it was to understand why some of these results were not kind of what we expected, right? So we revise our text to make sure that we do not overstate and to use an interpretation that we make of interviews, and we tone down the link. Maybe in the first version, I'm sure we didn't pay attention to the wording, but we kind of did. So at the end, that was it, and we got it published in JBE, right? So that was a pretty, I would say, simple way to get a mixed method, well, kind of a mixed method paper in. This one was slightly more complicated, and I have to give you a backstory. So this paper now is published in 2018 in JBE as well. So maybe JBE is the way to go for mixed methods, but it did not start this way at all. Okay, it started with a different paper, a different, which ended up in AOS, that one. But we also specifically said we are combining a quantitative method, and we combine different research analysis. We made it very explicit. Now this paragraph is nowhere in either paper because the papers have changed. So, but the reviewer comment were a little bit tougher because that submission was to AOS first. And I'll give you some kind of quote that they give us is the paper, because by that time we use Goffman, and you use quantitative method to analyze the political contribution of the paper, aspect of the paper. So they said that your paper is squarely interpretative. Remember, Goffman is a drama or an act. It's not a positivist qualitative theory. We need to justify more the use of mixed methods. Mixing is the problem. In fact, the mixing is the problem. The reviewer was kind enough to say, I have nothing against p-value and statistics. The mixing is a problem, right? So he or she were very nice about that. And then you should replacing with a more realist, positive perspective. And that's when we got the idea of changing Goffman to organized hypocrisy. Actually, we owe a lot to this reviewer who actually told us that if you're going to go that route, you should look at some of these positive perspective on power and hypocrisy, which, wow, we didn't know that we could classify it this way. So we responded that yes, we add more justification, because at that time it was just the Cooper and Morgan 2008 Accounting Horizons paper, which they kind of sadly looked down on, but okay, but we added more. And then the second round, I mean, there was a lot more, of course, to that. I'm just teasing out the method part comments. They remain committed to positive because we did not really stay away from it still, but you still need to justify the mixing of those methods. And the editor also added that you could mix the methods, but the problem is that you're using the mix of methodological frameworks, right? And you are using an interpretive theory along a positive method. So change the theory to a more positivist theory, and this is where maybe hypocrisy, as they saw it, was that I didn't know at that time. And say they also have two different method sections. That's the one they didn't like, to have these separated methods. So long story short, at the end we revise it. We remove the quant method completely, and we focus on this like very illustrative example. That paper ended up in AOS, and the other paper we kept Goffman and the quant method because we thought maybe this journal will be more open from experience, JBE, and say, you know, JBE rounds, that one they never even bring it up. It was like 2 rounds of not even question the method at all. So that was some kind of experience. At the end, we got a very good outcome of it. We got 2 papers, and that was my experience. So for me, conclusion for this topic, maybe JBE for mixed method is a better outlet than AOS, because, you know, AOS is taking religion and theory, you know, like a religion, right? So you cannot mess around with the mixing too much. Which ended up not having a mixed method and became the organized hypocrisy paper that you may have seen. And then the JBE paper became the Goffman front test backstage, which analyzed reports qualitatively and political activity quantitatively. Okay, and the last one, I'm just going to show you what my position is on methodological personal. First of all, should we have one? That's my question. Do we have to label ourselves as I'm quant, I'm qual, right? I mean, is it like something that you have to have? There is a misconception that critical, social, alternative accounting research use qualitative methods. Wrong. I'm one of them. I use quant. And that empirical, remember the so-called empirical archival research is quantitative. And you know that empirical can be qualitative, as I showed you. My PhD in the US has a lot of influence on me that I was trained quantitative. But ironically, one of my paper of my PhD, the sole author paper, my probably only one, is a qualitative paper, the total paper published in the AR in 2009. So needless to say, I kind of self-taught myself did. I mean, I got some help from, some, of course, supervision and also from different colleagues, but you can do it if you want to. This is a nice quote I got from Dan Patton when he wrote in the ACAJ back then when he was not a referee paper, that he's a critical accounting researcher who generally uses positivist or quantitative methods, and he would qualify himself as, to the positivist world, I am too radical, but in the radical world, I am too much the positivist. And this is exactly how I feel, or I used to feel a bit, when we use critical theory and social environmental accounting, but we illustrate it with methodological that are quantitative. And in conference I went to, I remember the alternative accounting conference, it was a very critical paper, but because I used number, the lady came up to me at the end and said, "You're a positivist." I'm like, "No, I'm not." Not the way that you describe. So it was a very shocking, like, wow, you just put numbers in and you're labeled as this mainstream accounting person. Like, no. So, and then when I go to Caesar, I use numbers first and kind of same thing. And then I bring the critical story to the quantitative, more mainstream conference, and they label me as this socialist / Marxist, sometimes communist researcher. Like, what are you doing challenging? So it's a bit of a tough spot to be. I think today we have passed that stage kind of, but back then, and when Dan wrote that piece 20 years ago, that's exactly how we felt, of like not being in one camp, because you have also that, it's not about the mixing the method, it was more about the story, the theory versus the method they're using as well. So I will end here. I hope I think I'm okay with time, and I'll pass it on to John or Rodi. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions, of course, at the end.